Catherine Campbell. I'm the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences here at John Carroll. Thank you all for coming tonight. A special welcome to the students and faculty and staff of the Bowler College of Business. I know you've got a big contingency here along with our arts and science students. I'm going to introduce our moderator for the evening, who's going to introduce our guests. We have Professor Dr. Colin Swearinger from the Department of Political Science, and we are now off and running.
Thank you, Catherine. Hopefully this is on and working. Welcome everyone to our event, talking about tariffs, trade, and Trump. And there's a lot that's going to be unpacked tonight about those topics, as well as how the media covers them. Before we get into that, I do want to introduce, first of all, the gentleman to my left. This is Daniel Desrochers. He's an international trade reporter at Politico, who has reported extensively on the Trump administration's tariffs, as well as the congressional response. Previously, he covered Congress, the White House, and the courts for the Kansas City Star, and prior to that, he was a reporter for the Lexington Herald-Leader and the Charleston Gazette-Mail. He is a graduate of the University of Arizona and a native of New Jersey who happens to root for the Red Sox. So if he gets distracted around 8 o'clock tonight, you know why.
Because he has a short attention span.
Yes. On my right, of course, is Pete Williams, who many of you know. You know him, of course, from his career at the Pentagon, his 29 years at NBC News, his 3 Emmy Awards, and he is uniquely qualified to talk about constitutional issues as well as the media landscape here in the United States. Of course, I do want to highlight his deep connection with our very own Tim Russert, who was responsible for bringing him to NBC News in 1993. And of course, that has led Pete to John Carroll University as our journalist in residence. And every time I introduce Pete, I like to talk about how I get to know him better. And I have to say that last night we had dinner, and I've never seen somebody get so excited when they heard the word TK-42, which is a camera. His eyes got as big as saucers, and that's not a Star Wars droid. It is an old camera. So he loves that old technology, and it's fun to hear him talk about that. So thank you, gentlemen, both of you, for being here tonight. I'm going to start things off straightforward. Daniel, what is a tariff?
So yeah, basically, can you hear me? Yeah. So effectively, a tariff is a tax on imported goods. They take a chunk off the good when it comes to the country, and that's about it. That's the cleanest definition.
Cleanest definition. Now, Pete, where in the Constitution do we see tariffs come into play?
Let's look at our Constitution, shall we?
Pull them out.
So it's in Article 1, which is the powers of the Congress, Section 8. Here's what it says. The Congress, notice it doesn't say the President, the Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. Imposts is what the Founding Fathers called tariffs. Imposts, impositions, imposts. So the tariff power is clearly one given to Congress, not the President.
Turning back to Daniel, when we began having conversations about what we were going to talk about tonight, one of the words that you mentioned that stood out to me was uncertainty. Why is this such an uncertain time in this area?
Yeah, so uncertainty has basically been the word of the year. Every time I talk to a member of Congress or business owner or whoever, they bring up the word uncertainty. And that's effectively because we're in unprecedented ground. We are participating in a really grand experiment with tariffs in a way that hasn't happened since the 1920s. And so both the new landscape where we are taking an approach with higher tariffs than ever, plus the rapid fire pace in which these tariffs are being released has just caused a massive amount of uncertainty, because it's really hard for businesses to predict, how much they're going to have to pay for the goods, where to move things, where to shore their manufacturing. All the decisions have been colored by the sense of the ground feeling like it's moving underneath.
And you wrote an article, I think maybe yesterday or so about the pharmaceuticals, right? And I think this highlights that example. If you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, no, I mean that's a great example. So last week there were a couple of truths on Truth Social, and the president just kind of issued a volley of proclamations. He said we're going to have tariffs on pharmaceuticals that go as high as 100%. We're going to have tariffs on heavy trucks, and we're going to have tariffs on lumber, as well as like bathroom vanities and cabinets and wooden upholstered furniture. He said all of those social media posts said that these tariffs were going to go into effect on October 1st. Well, October 1st came and went, and none of the tariffs were in effect. The lumber tariffs are actually going to go into effect on October 14th. They're actually going to start lower than what he said in that social media post, and will go higher on January 1st. The pharmaceutical tariffs, which everybody has really been watching, it's been a massive part of these trade negotiations with other countries like the EU and Japan, and those aren't going to go into effect for the unforeseeable future because the administration is trying to negotiate deals directly with drug companies. And then the heavy trucks tariffs, they wouldn't really tell me what's going on with those, but they seem delayed. And that's the kind of sense here, right? You might get the president saying, hey, we're going to put 100% tariff on movies, and then the tariff just kind of goes away because they haven't actually followed through with an order. And so it makes it really challenging for anybody who's watching this to know what's actually going to happen, how much time do they have to really bargain with him, how much room is the administration going to give, and it creates this kind of disorderly environment, particularly when you compare it to tariff policy in the past, where there have been like very clear regulations and a process in which businesses can say, hey, this is how we want it to be.
And you mentioned follow through with an order. That's an executive order from the president and the executive branch, right?
I was going to say an executive order, although the one reason there was a proclamation. And so, but there's paper documenting it, right? Like they do have to issue paper that says, hey, this is how this is going to go down. Here are all the details of what's going on.
And what's fascinating, Pete, is the justification for some of this, at least at some point in time, has been the word emergency. That Trump needs to do this, the administration has to do this because of an emergency. What role does that play constitutionally in this whole matter?
None. What role it plays as a matter of statutory interpretation is the whole ballgame. So, as you know, the Supreme Court is going to hear argument on the president's authority to issue the tariffs that have been issued so far. Now, Daniel can tell us what the White House has up its sleeve in terms of trying to invoke other laws to justify tariffs. But the president basically said we have to have tariffs for a couple of reasons. First of all, Canada and Mexico are flooding fentanyl in to the country. It's poisoning our citizens. It's killing people. So we need to do something to encourage them to do a better job. And then he said there's the balance of payments deficit. So he invoked something called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, which I will now, for all the rest of the evening, call IEPA for obvious reasons. Now this is what it says. It says that in dealing with, quote, an unusual or extraordinary overseas threat to the national security, foreign policy, or economy of the United States, the president can regulate imports. So that's what the president has said gives him the power to do what he's done. But the legal question is, what does regulate mean? That is the whole question. The president says, well, that's where my authority comes from to impose these tariffs. I'm regulating imports. The challengers say the word tariff appears nowhere in IEPA. Yeah, he can raise or lower the amount of imports. That's what regulate means, but it doesn't mean what he says it means, which is to levy additional imports. Now, let me just say one other thing. It's clear that in the past, the courts and the Congress have given the president a certain amount of wiggle room. He can make minor adjustments in tariffs as long as they're within the general boundaries of this very complicated schedule of tariff rates. What the challengers say is he can't go completely off the reservation, for example, and set 100% tariffs on pharmaceuticals. But regulate is the key word.
Yeah, right. Sure. I mean, the other question here, if we break down these cases, and part of where we're looking at the arguments, both for the businesses and for the administration, they kind of want it on separate turf. And let me know, Pete, if I'm stepping on your answers here.
No, go for it.
But so the administration is arguing that this is a national security emergency. They say that we've had a trade deficit for too long. It's killing our country. Manufacturing is declining. We don't have enough jobs. We don't have the ability to stand up, steel plants and pharmaceuticals if there's another medical emergency, that sort of thing. So they want this case to be kind of settled on the national security side because the president does have a lot of national security powers. If the argument is in that court, they're in a better position. That said, the businesses are arguing he's gone too far. There's this aspect of rulings lately, we saw it pop up during the Biden administration, where they called it the major question.
Well, let's get to that in a second, because that's a separate thing. But I think the root of the question is in just the way you phrased it, because you said this has been going on a long time.
Yes.
And so therefore, it's as something that's been going on a long time, is that an emergency? I guess what the Trump administration is saying is, yeah, it's been going on so long that now it's an emergency. But it's a little hard to make this argument that you're invoking the emergency powers of the president for something that's been going on for decades. And my understanding, and you know this better, is that the overall level of the balance of payments deficit hasn't really changed in the last couple of decades, right? It's actually not any worse than it's been since maybe 10 or 15 years ago. So, where's the fire, I guess, is what some of the challengers are saying. How can this be an emergency for something that's been going on so long?
Mentioning national security, obviously one of the countries that we deal with on this topic is China, and there's been a big focal point of the Trump administration, not only in their entire foreign policy, but specifically as it relates to tariffs. What is that dynamic? Because again, uncertainty comes into play here. I have a hard time following it.
There's been like 5 rounds of talks so far, so yeah. Basically, China is the big player here. That's who the administration kind of has their eyes on. They're the ones who are driving a lot of this economic policy because there are a couple things here. We're in Cleveland, steel is a big thing. China has been able to just kind of dump steel into the global market in a way that it's really affected the global steel economy, and the steel and aluminum tariffs that are currently at 50% are in some ways a way to defend against that, right? And so China and the US are kind of, we're in a trade war right now. I mean, that's the easiest way to put it. If I can give you the whole history of in Trump's first administration, China was really the target. That's what they were going after. They lifted tariffs on China, and then they had this agreement. There was a phase 1 deal, there was supposed to be a phase 2 deal, and it involved agriculture purchases and China lowering some tariff barriers, that sort of thing. In the intervening years, China all of a sudden was like, oh, the US is really serious about tariffs. And so they've spent their time kind of brushing up and making sure that their defenses are stronger this time around. And so as the administration again targeted China, first with the fentanyl tariffs, which the emergency justification for this was that we are in a state of fentanyl emergency, and so therefore we must tariff Mexico, Canada, and China. And so we put those on, China didn't retaliate, then we put the next level of tariffs on, China threatened to retaliate, and I think did retaliate, and that then launched the administration's focus solely to China. And we hit basically an embargo where the US had more than 100% tariffs on Chinese goods, China had around 100% tariffs on US goods, and trade was basically, it stopped for a while. There were fewer cargo ships coming in from China, and it was starting to have a ripple effect on the economy where, if you're not bringing container ships into the ports in the West Coast, there are fewer jobs for truckers. People were actually starting to say to the administration, hey, we need something here. And so the US met with China and we established a sort of truce. We still have high tariff levels, but now there's a little bit of a truce in this trade war, and And so we're in the stage now where they're tinkering at little edges. One of those things is export controls. China has basically pinned the market in some of the heavy metals that are really important for, car batteries, stuff that we would need every day. And so they pinched that lever, and that brought the U.S. back to the table to try and get them to loosen it. Another lever that they're pinching is there have been no purchases of soybeans since May, when this kind of trade war really first heated up. And that has been devastating to farmers. I mean, we're now in the fall harvest, and they have no soybean purchases. And so we're seeing this kind, and the U.S. has been doing this too, right? They limited export controls of chips that China needs, and we're seeing this kind of tit for tat, feeling each other out sort of trade war as that's going on. The most recent example, which I think is where you're headed, was TikTok.
That is where I was headed, yeah.
And so Congress passed a law saying TikTok is a national security threat. We don't like that they have this algorithm that is addictive to everybody. They can push content, they can collect all this information about our US users, and we don't know where it's going, if it's being stored in Beijing. And so last year, Congress passed a law, it was bipartisan, and they said TikTok needs to divest or else it will be banned in the US. So it basically needs to find a US buyer or it will be banned. The problem is that TikTok's really popular. It's addictive. Everybody likes to scroll on it. It's a great app that I'm not on. And so when the ban was officially set to go into effect because the Supreme Court upheld it, President Biden put a pause on it, and then President Trump continued that pause. And the idea was that they were going to just give time for ByteDance, which is the company that controls TikTok, to find a buyer. And so there was a delay and a delay and a delay. And as the most recent delay was coming up, the US and China once again met, and they said that they came away with a deal. And so now it was announced last week, I would still call it a framework of a deal. Nothing has really been signed yet, but it does look like there will be a kind of some sort of an agreement where a bunch of US companies like Oracle, which is owned by Larry Ellison, I think Dell is somehow involved, they're going to be able to take control of some aspects of ByteDance. ByteDance is still going to keep a minority stake. JD Vance said it was worth about $14 billion. And so we're in a kind of state, but the real consequence here was there's another 120-day pause. So everybody can keep using TikTok for another 120 days as they try to hammer out the aspects of this deal.
Colin, can I just do a little diversion here for a second? Something very instructive about how Donald Trump has handled this. Congress passed a law saying the president could put a pause on the ban of TikTok once for 90 days if a deal was imminent. President Trump has done it 4 times. He's put a 90-day pause on it 4 times. Not only that, but the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, sent a letter to tech companies saying, you know what, I know it's illegal right now for you to allow TikTok to be used by users in the US. Don't worry, we're not going to come after you. The president has decided that keeping TikTok going is in the national interest. It's part of his national security powers. So let's just ignore this little law. In other words, arguing that the President of the United States has an authority that English kings had until the 18th century, known as the dispensing power, to just ignore laws that they found inconvenient. That's in essence what Donald Trump has done with TikTok. Now, Daniel put his finger on it. No one seems to care. Congress certainly is going to object that he's disobeyed the law 4 times in having extra bans because it is so popular. But it's a strange way to administer that law.
I want to follow up with you on this, Pete, for 2 questions. Number 1, is this a First Amendment free speech case? So the court has weighed on this, and I was hoping you could summarize that. The second question is, have you shut down your TikTok account?
Well, I don't have one, so that's not a problem. I have a coal-burning television set, so I'm not exactly hip, which is going to come as a great shock to you, I know. It's not really a First Amendment question, and what the Supreme Court said in deciding to uphold the congressional ban is, yeah, there are First Amendment issues here, but they're outweighed by what the government claims is the national security problem with ByteDance getting their mitts on everybody's data. So, you know, there's no such thing as an absolute freedom in the Constitution. The courts are always engaged in these balancing tests, and that's what happened in the case of TikTok.
Dan, I want to get back to something you mentioned earlier. You brought up soybeans, and this is a problem right now with the fall harvest. But we saw in the first Trump administration that farmers were disproportionately affected by tariffs. One, do you expect that to happen again moving forward? And two, what did Trump do in his first term to alleviate that? And what do you think he might do, or is he talking about for this time around?
Yes, farmers are being affected. It is happening right now. Their input costs are higher, fertilizer costs are higher, and their export markets are being affected by these trade wars. Soybean farmers, I already mentioned, corn growers are also having a problem where there's just, the commodity prices are really low right now and they're struggling. Farmers, so if I step back into history real quick, farmers are traditionally the ones who are the most affected by tariffs, and they're also the ones who tend to protest the most. So if you even go back to President McKinley, who was one of, or President Trump really likes President McKinley as his model, McKinley was kind of battling against the original Populist Party, which was in part formed by farmers who were saying, hey, these tariffs are not good for us. They're driving up our inputs and they're lowering our commodity prices, and they don't like it. That said, I talked to a lot of Republicans from farm-heavy states. I've reached out to a lot of farmers, and they're feeling really patient right now. They just don't have this kind of sense of urgency for pressuring Trump to change this in a significant way. You do have some farm state Republicans like Chuck Grassley. He's been putting a little pressure on them, but it's not really serious pressure. It's been writing letters and putting out press releases complaining about it. But in this Congress, that's kind of the most extreme most Republicans have gone. And so what I'm hearing here is basically trust in Trump. He's going to make it all right, and that's partially because in the first term there was a bailout for farmers. They used a special program in Congress to redirect money so that farmers could be made whole for however much they lost due to the first round of trade wars. This time they're talking about doing something similar. The program that they used last time is now much lower in funding, and so you see them floating this idea that they are going to take the tariff revenue that they have earned, which is more than $160 billion so far, and they are going to use some of that to pay back farmers. That's something that the president suggested the other day. The other thing that he's kind of talking about is he's now set to meet with Chinese leader Xi Jinping coming up soon, and it's going to be a topic of their discussion. We'll see how much China really does on this. Yes, they did make a massive purchase of soybeans after that first round of the first trade war in the first Trump administration, but they never completed the order that they said they would, and so they didn't fully live up to it. That's something that the administration has blamed former President Biden for, and so we'll see how much negotiating, haggling, or whatever goes on.
So there seems like there's quite a bit of controversy, including some legal controversy. Pete, where is this issue right now in the courts? Because there's been some movement over the last 8 months or so legally.
Right. So there were a series of lawsuits filed, and the three most prominent went to two separate courts. One went to the district court in Washington, D.C., a couple of toy makers, a couple of businesses challenging the tariffs. The government said, this has no business being in this court. Trade cases are all handled by the Court of International Trade, which is the latest version of a court that's been around since 1890. And so, you've got no jurisdiction here, Judge. We're going to take this case away from you. He said, no, you're not. This is about this IEPA law, and I've read it, and it doesn't say tariffs anywhere. So this is not about a tariffs, so I'll keep the case, which should tell you how he decided the case. The others went to the Court of International Trade. They were appealed to the Court of Federal Claims. The U.S. Supreme Court has put these on a fast track. They'll hear argument on November 5th. But basically, all the courts that have looked at this have sort of come to the same conclusion. And let me just quote a little bit from, and as I said earlier, this is not a constitutional question. This is all about what does the statute mean? What does IEPA say? The lower court said, number one, the word tariff doesn't appear anywhere in the statute, nor do any of its synonyms, that he can do a lot of things to regulate, but he can't impose tariffs. To quote the appeals court here, none of these actions in IEPA explicitly include the power to impose tariffs, duties, or the like, or the power to tax. And the other problem is the one that you brought up, Colin, which is the fact that the Constitution says the tariff power belongs to Congress, not the president, which they said makes it a little hard to read IEPA as though the tariff power is in there, since it explicitly is given to another branch of the government. Now let me get to the point that Daniel previewed here a moment ago. So the appeals court did something that I think is quite crafty. They wrote the decision with the Supreme Court conservatives in mind. The Supreme Court in recent years, going back to a case about regulated tobacco, has said, you know what? When the executive, the president, or an independent federal agency tries to do something that has major political or economic consequences, it can only do that if Congress has explicitly given the executive that power. They called this is judge-made law, they called it, and Daniel referred to it a moment ago, the major questions doctrine. Now, the court has generally invoked this doctrine to sort of shut down the power of the administrative state. It's a darling of the conservatives in the courts because they think the executive, the president, and some of these independent agencies have too much power. So they've used this major questions doctrine to, for example, say the EPA couldn't impose certain greenhouse gas emission controls, that some of the restrictions of the COVID era restrictions couldn't be imposed. The Biden student loan forgiveness. They all said these fail the major question doctrine test. So the Federal Appeals Court said, what could be a more major question than this, especially given that tariffs and imported goods, or imported goods rather, account for 14% of the economy. So they said, if there was ever a major question, this is it, and therefore the Trump administration fails the major questions doctrine test. Now, I'll just tell you what the Trump administration's answer to that has been in the briefs it has filed so far in the Supreme Court. It has said it can't touch us because the president is different. It's true that the major questions doctrine applies to the Federal Drug Administration or a lot of these other, the Department of Education when it comes to student loans, but not the president, because he has this authority over national security, and so the major questions doctrine can't touch him. And the Supreme Court's going to have to decide that question. But you're right. So in the Supreme Court, the questions are really, does this IEPA talking about regulate, does that include the power to impose tariffs? One. Two, you can only use that power if it's a national emergency. Is this a national emergency? And three, does this fail the major questions doctrine? So those are the main questions that the Supreme Court will tangle with when they hear the case in just over a month.
Daniel, you mentioned that you've talked to a lot of Republican legislators. I'm curious, in your conversations, do you think a lot of them are hoping that this loses in court?
To some extent, but it won't solve the problem. And he's asking that because for a really long time, obviously, the Republican Party has generally been the party of free trade. And so you can kind of see, you can almost see it generationally, this divide, particularly among Republican senators. It's easier to just take the Senate smaller. And you know, those who have been in Congress for longer, who came up probably through, you know, Reagan, Bush, there's a lot of guys who are in their 80s there. They support free trade, and so they're really struggling with this, especially the ones who come from farm states, because, like I said earlier, farmers are the first affected. But Trump has this power right now over Congress where they're just having to kind of bite their tongue and go along with it. He's got such a command over the Republican base that to speak out would be really, it would be a challenge. Then you have the other side of the Republican Party, this kind of newer, the people who came in after Trump was first elected, or when Trump really kind of altered the Republican Party, and they are thoroughly, enthusiastically, fully on board. Both of Ohio's senators, I would put them in this category. They believe in this. They believe in the protectionist mission that the president is trying to do here. And so, yes, some of them are kind of hoping that the IEEPA tariffs are overturned, but the administration has been very clear. If this doesn't succeed in court, they're going to find another way to do it. And they have other mechanisms to do it. There are other sections of tariff law that they can use a mechanism for you with numbers.
Well, can I just interrupt to ask, you say other ways to do it. How are those are ways? Because under IEEPA, the president is claiming this authority to the sky's the limit on tariffs. If he invokes these other statutes, is it clear that he has that much flexibility?
He will not have the same amount of flexibility, but they are going to push the limit on some of the other statutes to try and figure out how they can do this as effectively as possible. What I was going to say is that they'll use these other mechanisms. They are in the statute. They put in a few more guardrails. There are a few more hoops that they have to jump through. They might have to do investigations into specific things. They may have to claim national security threats about the EU or that sort of thing. But they're going to try and stretch these laws to their full potential to do it. And so
that well-known European threat.
The French are sending over too many striped shirts, and it's a national security threat. When I talk to diplomats, when I talk to other countries who are actively negotiating these trade deals and really seeking to push down the tariffs, probably more so than Republican lawmakers, they're kind of dismissing the Supreme Court case. They're like, whatever happens will happen. We can't control that. We have to prepare for the worst. And the administration has assured us that this will not stop their efforts to impose tariffs. And so they're really just not, they're acting as if this Supreme Court case does not matter at all, and they're continuing to negotiate. Whether, that's what they're saying to me, and quietly they're like, ooh, I hope it fails, I hope it fails, I hope it fails. That's a different question. But everyone I talk to feels really convinced that this is a thing that the administration is passionate about. This is a thing that Donald Trump has been passionate about since the 1980s. And he's going to continue to go through it.
So Pete, the Supreme Court is hearing this case in the upcoming term.
Yep.
I've read some legal analysis from both on the ideological left, on the ideological right, and they seem to be fairly unanimous that the Trump administration will lose at the Supreme Court, which tells me there's a good chance they're wrong, right? I mean, it's not how it works, right?
I wouldn't put any money on it for a couple of reasons. One is that the administration so far has tried to strike the fear of God into the Supreme Court justices, saying, oh man, you are going to just do a terrible thing if you rule against us. This is just some of the stuff that's in the brief so far. President Trump himself the other day said this: 1 year ago, the United States was a dead country. And now, because of the trillions of dollars being paid by countries that have so badly abused us, America is strong, financially viable, and respected again. The Solicitor General, the government's top courthouse lawyer, says, the president and his cabinet officials have determined that the tariffs are promoting peace and unprecedented economic prosperity, and that the denial of tariff authority would expose our nation to trade retaliation without effective defenses and thrust America back to the brink of economic catastrophe. And the Treasury Secretary has said in an affidavit in one of these briefs, you know what? If you rule against us, we have to pay all this stuff back. And that's just going to, play havoc with the Treasury. We're going to be almost broke if we have to do this. So they are really leaning on the justices to say, I mean, that's not a legal argument. That is a policy argument. But they're saying, be careful, what you screw around with here, you can really do some harm to the country. That's the message that they're sending. But, I think it's a hard one to predict for this reason. Number one, the Supreme Court has never really said, well, this is the test for determining what a presidential emergency is. This is the same Supreme Court that just a couple of terms ago said, the president is the head of the executive branch. He has lots of power. You can't prosecute a president when he's acting within his core constitutional responsibilities. It was a very muscular decision that I think has given the president a lot of breathing room. So there is that. We go into that with that kind, and there are these other cases, Colin, where the Supreme Court seems to be saying the president has more power to fire the heads of executive agencies like the Federal Trade Commission, like the National Labor Relations Board, maybe the Federal Reserve Board, whenever he wants. He doesn't need to have cause. He doesn't need to have proof that they're not doing their jobs or they're stealing the money. He can just fire them whenever he wants. They seem to be leaning in that direction. A very muscular view of how much authority the president has. So that's kind of in the background. Then you look at the fact that there is this argument about the major questions doctrine. Does it apply to the president? There is this question about what is truly an emergency. Does the court have competence to decide that? And then there's this argument that the conservatives are making in favor of the Trump administration. They say, suppose the president gets up one day and says, China is a serious threat to us. I am going to stop all imports from China. Now, I don't think anyone would argue that that authority is not in IEPA. It says he can regulate trade. So if he can do that, if he can completely shut the door to imports from China, the argument goes, why can't he impose tariffs to restrict trade with China? That's sort of a lesser power within that greater power. So why can't he impose these tariffs? These are sort of questions of first impression. I'll say one other thing. Remember that until Congress imposed the income tax, tariffs were the main source of income for the federal government. And yet, there are surprisingly few Supreme Court cases on the authority of tariffs, and especially when it comes to the president. So there isn't a lot of precedent to fall back on here, and that's why I think this is a tough one to call.
I want to ask one more question of each of them. It's going to be the same question. I want to get both of your opinions on this, and then we'll open up the floor for Q&A. So if our students who are handling the microphones can get those ready, and for those of you that want to ask questions, tee them up in your mind. But my question for both of you is this. Peter's established that Article 1, Section 8 is the constitutional framework for tariffs. You've talked about, you're reporting on Congress and how it works. What are the odds? And I couch this in the fact that I'm a big fan of Article 1. What are the odds that Congress will do something in the next 5 to 10 years to figure this out?
You tripped me out. You said 5 to 10 years.
I know it's not happening in the next 2 or 3, 5 to 10.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's momentum among kind of free traders in the Republican Party to say, hey, this has gotten completely out of control. The executive is taking too much power. We need to pull it back to Congress. This is supposed to be our job. Can that pass? I don't know. I mean, in watching Congress, it takes a lot to get these things to pass. And can you get bipartisan support for it? Maybe. So I don't know. It's in the realm of possibility. I am going to steal, let me say one other thing that is not relevant to the question, and kind of two other things. The one is, we've spent so much time talking about the IEPA tariffs because those are the kind of earth-shattering, haven't been done before, things that we're seeing all these blasted posts when the president decides he wants to put on a tariff, he's using them. There are other tariffs that are in effect. They're called Section 232 tariffs. They involve an investigation and a national security argument to oppose them. And so that's where you see the tariffs on automobiles, on steel and aluminum, on copper, and then there's the more to come, lumber, the pharmaceuticals, et cetera, et cetera. Those are relatively legally sound. People tried to challenge the steel and aluminum tariffs back in Trump's first term. They didn't succeed. And so those are sticking around, and when you do talk with other countries who are negotiating it, these deals, those are the ones that are really kind of sticking in their craw more than the IEEPA tariffs. And so those are going to continue to be this kind of factor of uncertainty that we see. And that's one where Congress can't really pull back. They already gave away that power. They would have to write a law saying like, no, actually we didn't want to do this, or we want prior approval, or something of that sort. Now, somebody asked me a question about the legal implications of national security, right? Like, so what's the national security implications for a bathroom vanity? We can get into that later. But that is a kind of really important factor to consider here, is that he is really flexing his muscles in as many ways as possible to really, I think, fundamentally reshape global trade. And I think the genie has kind of been taken out of the bottle. I don't think it's being put back in. When you talk to other countries, people are saying like, okay, the game's changed. We need to start moving towards this more protectionist stance. And it's time to. He's proven that you can do it, and he's proven that you can do it without a lot of retaliation. And so I think that we're now looking at a completely changed game. And Congress, I don't think, can do much to really change it back.
So I would defer to Daniel in terms of understanding what Congress is all about. The only thing I would add to it is I think it depends on how much economic pain tariffs impose on American consumers. If the prices for things that we all buy just go crazy, if it becomes prohibitive to shop at Target, then Congress may step up and do something.
All right, so we are now in line for those of you from the audience who would like to ask questions. What I am going to ask is that when you ask a question, that whoever answers it first here, repeat the question into your microphones. That way those who are watching online will be able to hear that. We had some issues Monday night with that. So with that, which questions do we have? We have one over here. And we've got microphones on both sides, so be patient. And yeah.
So there have been a lot of tariffs paid in the past 8 months. They get ruled unconstitutional. Do the companies get refunds? How does that work? Thank you.
That's the $1 million question.
So the question was, if Trump loses how do the tariffs, who has to pay them back? Or do the companies get their money back, or what?
And we were actually just talking about this at dinner. It's really complicated, and it would be a complicated process. There is a kind of structure and order, because there's an importer of record who pays the tariffs, and so you have folks on who has actually paid the money, and you can theoretically give it back to them in that way. But the problem is that because tariffs are this kind of ambiguous tax, some of it gets passed off to the consumer, right? We've already seen higher prices at Target and Walmart and Home Depot saying that they're going to raise prices. Consumers probably aren't getting your money back. I don't think Home Depot's going to be like, yeah, here's the discount. But businesses can, I think, make an argument to at least get some of what they have paid back. How much they get back, what this looks like, I think that it would be a really kind of confusing and convoluted process. It would be fascinating to see how it actually unfolds. But it's actually something that the administration has warned the courts about when they say, hey, we'd have to give this all back. They're basically saying, like, not only would we have to give back all this revenue we collected, but also it would be a nightmare of a process. We don't really want to do that.
We have a question here in the front of the seats.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for coming to John Carroll. My question is, why did you fail to mention that the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, Section 233, the Trade Act of 1974, and the 4D-McCumber Tariff Act of 1913 gave presidents power to tariff? Furthermore, I think it's deceptive to not mention the World Trade Organization when talking about Trump's tariffs, considering it restricted the ability for other countries to tariff a lot. I mean, that's definitely something that needs to be brought up. And considering China's, when they joined the World Trade Organization, it was under the premise that they wouldn't dump a ton of products into other markets than they did. So I feel like, the US responding with tariffs is the obvious choice to combat that.
So I'll let Daniel take a crack at that too. The question was, what about all the other federal statutes that give the president power to impose tariffs? I'll tell you what the courts have said about this, because the administration has made some of those arguments that you just made. And I referred to this a little bit earlier. What the courts have said, yes, the president does have, there's some play in the joints. The president can make some adjustments in the level of tariffs, but they're within a predetermined channel. That's this complicated schedule of tariffs that has its roots in the Congress. Because of Article 1, Section 8, it says it's the Congress that sets tariffs, not the executive. What the courts have said is that by going beyond those limitations that are in the statutes you just cited, he's now violating the terms of IEEPA and going too far. As for the World Trade Organization and with the rest of your question, I'll defer to Daniel.
Yeah, and the first part of the question, I didn't cite the statute specifically, but when I talk about Section 232, when I talk about the other mechanisms that the administration has to set tariffs, that's what I'm talking about, right? So like he very clearly has powers here. And when I talked about the 232s being more legally sound, I was specifically referencing the statutes that you were talking about. That said, yes, the World Trade Organization has really become toothless, and in a way where I think there are extremely valid arguments about how China has kind of manipulated this, which is another thing that I mentioned, right? The kind of dumping that China has been doing. The World Trade Organization hasn't been able to step up and enforce that and prevent that from happening. So the administration is addressing what has been an issue, and that everybody across the world has seen, right? Like we're now starting to see the EU step up here, and they're now embracing tariffs and steel quotas. And so, yeah, I mean, I think the root here, and I don't think that anybody would argue with the root of this problem, right? If you look at 2024, both the Democrats and the Republicans were arguing that, hey, we probably need to embrace more tariffs. We need to be doing something to address the global playing field, right? If you look at the Biden administration, he slapped like 100% tariff on electric vehicles from China because China was dumping electric vehicles across the world and really lowering prices there, and he was trying to protect the domestic market. So this is obviously a policy debate that's going on. I think that what you're getting at is we've focused a lot more on the IEEPA tariffs and on the kind of, I think going in, if you had polled Democrats, they would have said that tariffs were the area where there was going to be the most bipartisan support, where they were going to be able to help, find common ground, deal with some of these things like pharmaceuticals and steel and automobiles. And instead, what we've seen is this really kind of ambitious effort on the Trump administration's part to even step beyond where there was common ground to let's really go for this. Let's really change the global trade landscape. And so I think that our focus has been more on that kind of ambitious effort where he's kind of stepped out beyond the norm. And underneath that is a foundation of kind of bipartisan agreement of both parties saying there are serious issues here that we do need to address. And if you talk to a Democrat about this, they'll say, I think he's gone too far with tariffing Canada or whatever, but tariffs are an important tool in our toolbox that we should be using to try and help the domestic economy.
Can I just add on to that question, Daniel?
Yeah.
Is there a sense in which the president has used really high tariff levels as leverage to accomplish other things, to sort of a foot in the door to negotiate in other areas? If I'm going to slap this huge tariff on you unless you do something else that I want.
Yeah. Well, and I think what the administration would basically say, tariffs are working so well. This is how they would clarify it, or cast it, that it's enabled them to kind of go even farther. So the 50% tariff on India, that was not necessarily India does have really high tariffs, and there's a legitimate kind of negotiation going on there about India's tariffs. But that was also because India was importing oil from Russia and then selling it. And so he was using the tariffs to try and stop India from doing that as he tries to resolve the Russia and Ukraine war. Brazil, he didn't like the case that was going on against former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro. I think I just butchered his first name. I've only had to write it and not say it. And so he imposed 50% tariffs on Brazil in that way. I'm now like just kind of going off road, but the biggest kind of fascinating thing here, in my perspective, is we do have these early trade agreements. The trade agreements with Japan and South Korea involve investment pledges of $550 billion from Japan, $350 billion from South Korea. The administration, which has been touting all these different companies saying that they're going to break ground, more car manufacturers saying that they're going to start to manufacture here. They've been touting all that. They said that's not enough for Japan and South Korea. What we actually want to see is we are going to give you investment projects and you are going to have to fund them. They can technically veto them or whatever. It's creating a sovereign wealth fund, and it's part of this larger effort for the executive branch to get kind of more of a say in what investments are going on. I mean, they took a stake in Intel. We have the golden share in U.S. Steel. It's really interesting to see how this kind of like Wall Street influenced cabinet is trying to use that Wall Street expertise to take a more active role in the economy in a way that is kind of unprecedented. And so part of that comes from, they feel like tariffs have worked so well in bringing other countries to the negotiating table. Why wouldn't we be using this for businesses? Why wouldn't we be using this power to get other countries to stop doing other things? Why would we not use it to maybe even create a sovereign wealth fund in some ways to then make sure that money is steered to projects that the private sector might not necessarily want to engage in without a little bit of support?
More questions? We have one from Joe.
Thank you guys for being here tonight. I'm curious to go back to the idea of dispensement. Have the courts had a chance to rule on this issue yet? And if they haven't, could you provide some more background on the issue?
On the dispensing authority?
Yes.
Yes, the Supreme Court ruled in the late 1800s that there is no such dispensing power, and by the way, there's this other inconvenient part of the Constitution that says the president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. So it's just the opposite of a dispensing power. The Supreme Court says you have to faithfully execute the laws. So the Constitution says he can't do it, and the Supreme Court explicitly said there isn't one.
Got a question here, and then back to the middle.
Hi, thank you all for being here, speaking and sharing your knowledge with us. My question is a little bit less on tariffs and trade and more concerned with like our policy and what we're doing internationally. In terms of like looking into Congress, probably not within the next 2 years, maybe 5, 10, 15 years. From what you know, do you think we will start to see candidates or politicians refrain from taking funds from AIPAC or being funded on a campaign from AIPAC, and on both left and right? I know we've seen a few candidates who are not funded by this organization, but still lackers. Thank you.
The question is, in the future, will we see more candidates not take funds from AIPAC?
I mean, I think we're already seeing it. I think it's just going to depend, right? It's going to depend on your constituency. It's going to depend on how much voters see this as a deal breaker. There have been races where AIPAC has really, so in Missouri, Wesley Bell beat Cori Bush last year. When was that election? 2021?
So I think it would be helpful if there's anybody here that doesn't know what AIPAC is to say what it is.
It is a pro-Israel PAC that helps fund candidates that take pro-Israel stances. And so yeah, that race, AIPAC put a lot of money in it. Wesley Bell won. And so if we see things like that, then candidates will say, hey, I can still take money from this organization. It's not going to be politically toxic. And so it just really kind of, I think it depends on how do the voters respond. Do they feel punished for taking that money, etc.?
But I would say if you're talking about whether Congress would outlaw it, I wouldn't think so, no.
Yeah, generally on the money thing, they want money. So outlawing money.
Yeah.
bad.
Please don't give us so much money.
Yeah.
No, I think you had a question.
Hi, thank you for being here. My question goes back towards that section 232 that you had mentioned, and I'm just curious, if the administration is already passing tariffs under that statute, why are they putting tariffs under other statutes that are so combative that they end up in the Supreme Court?
Yeah, so the question is, if they already have 232, if they already have these mechanisms, why are they trying it this other way? I can paraphrase your question, if I paraphrase your question. And the reason is flexibility, right? With IEPA, the way he's been using it, he can say, hey, this thing is happening that I don't like, I'm gonna put this tariff on it as soon as possible. So it's faster, he can kind of set levels that are even higher, like there are constraints on how high tariffs can go under certain, I think it's under certain sections, I think there's 501, but I think 501 is just up to 15%. But don't fact check me on that because I sometimes get the number wrong.
Well, isn't there also a mechanism in these other legal authorities? He can't just do it unilaterally.
Yes.
There has to be an interagency process, and it's more time consuming, and
There have to be
certain.
investigations.
Yeah.
Section 301 you say it's a national security threat. So there are just kind of guardrails on those powers. And that makes it, it's the way that the administration's been working is they've been doing a lot of things very quickly. And this was the fastest, kind of most effective way for them to do it. And nobody had tried it before, so you might as well take the shot because they'll let you, they had now however many months to play around with this thing, see how it's worked, see how other countries respond. They experimented with it, and arguably, I would say the experiment has probably paid off for what they were trying to do.
We have time for one or two more questions, if anyone has them.
One right there. Yes? Someone's coming to you eventually.
We got one right here and one right there. So those will be the last two questions. We'll get this one on my left.
So my question is, number one, have these tariffs affected de-dollarization in any way? Number two, have they affected the overall value of the dollar?
He's wondering, have the tariffs affected the overall value of the dollar, right? Well, the dollar is not as strong as it was. There are a couple of factors there. I mean, tariffs do affect this, but that is more economic policy and is generally beyond my purview. But yes, the dollar is weaker than it was a few months ago.
What was the second part of the question? The value of the dollar and what else?
De-dollarization.
De-dollarization.
Oh, okay, same thing.
And then our last question over here, Sebastian.
Thank you for doing this. So in the original plan for the economic plan, when they rolled it out on January 20th, there was the talk of the wonderfully deceptive external revenue service. Has that ever actually been implemented? That was one question, and then related to that, assume that the Supreme Court does not strike these tariffs down, what are they actually going to do with this money? Are there any restrictions on this, or could this really become a major revenue source for the government going forward, saying this is the way we raise money now, going back to pre-income tax times?
Yeah, I think both of those are really good questions. So he asked if, so there was talk of an external revenue service early on in the administration, and then the second, let me take that one first, and then I'll do the second one, because I might forget in the process. So the external revenue service, this was an idea that was floated. It hasn't really gone anywhere. Part of that is because we already have an external revenue service, which is Customs and Border Protection, which collects all this money, and so there's a system in place. The actual political answer, my colleague has reported on this, it was a bit of a turf war. If you move it from Customs and Border Protection, which is under the Department of Homeland Security, but also you then take that away from a different cabinet and give it to another cabinet. And so there was a whole turf war going on between who actually gets this power and who gets to do it. It actually speaks to this larger, the thing that I was mentioning earlier about this. They've also tried to create a sovereign wealth fund, but that would involve an act of Congress, and then Congress would put guardrails on it. So the administration is really trying to kind of get some sort of pool of money that they can play with, whether it's to invest in specific companies and try and gain revenue that way, because you're actually like earning income for the government off of some of these investments, or and so they're using, right now, the plan, if Japan goes through this, would be to use foreign money to kind of do what they were thinking about doing with the external revenue source. So there's something going on. They're really trying to do this. It's something that I'm tracking and following because they're really trying to, and then it goes to your next question, which is, if this does work and they're collecting more than 160 billion in revenue so far, is that way? Basically, they're collecting a lot of revenue.
Where does it go?
Yeah. And so the theory is, a lot of people are concerned about the national debt. It's growing. That's bad. It has bad implications. And they just passed the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which is going to increase the deficit. And so by having this tariff revenue, you can try and balance that out. And the CBO, the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, which tries to calculate how much these things will cost, they said the tariff revenue, if this stays the same, if it's this exact system over the next 10 years, it would actually offset the deficit of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And so that's a really appealing thing to the administration, and it's part of why folks think that the genie's not going back in the bottle, right? Because even if it doesn't look like the tariffs, even if you kind of lower the temperature, we've seen that other countries seem to be okay with the 10% tariff. Businesses are kind of accepting that. And so I think that it's changed the ballgame where now politicians say, hey, here's this source of revenue that I can tap into so that I can then fund this XYZ program that I want to do. And so it is a really new revenue stream. And building on that, the external revenue system, these efforts to get more in the hand in investments would also be trying to create a new revenue stream to offset some of those tax cuts.
Back to the future, when tariffs were the sole source of income for the federal government.
Yeah.
I will just say one thing. I hope you all have very short memories because I'm going to predict what the Supreme Court, I think, is going to do.
Pull out your phones.
I think, yeah, thanks a lot. So I think the odds that the administration wins across the board are remote, that he gets everything he wants. The odds that the Supreme Court absolutely says you can't do this are also remote. It seems to me more likely that the Supreme Court will say, he's got some authority here. Maybe they'll give him a little, maybe they'll remand it back to the court to say, yes, he has more authority than you think. You need to define what it is. That's a possibility. So I think the administration's going to come out of this with something. Maybe not 100% of what they want, a complete victory, but more than a total loss would be my guess.
And with that, thank you to both of our guests for being here tonight. Give them a round of applause. And thank you to everyone that attended. Students, we do have a QR code up on the screen if you need to scan that. Scan it in order to get your extra credits. Thank you for being here, and we look forward to seeing you next semester when Pete is back on campus.